manage water challenges. The session consists of 3 keynote addresses by Dr. Atul Singh, Dr. Ajay Pradhan and Dr. Mukund S. Babel, and 1 technical paper by Amitav Mukherjee.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Dr. Atul Singh, founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer USA. He is visiting lecturer on political economy, University of California, and also has spoken in various prestigious institutions and universities such as United Nations, Harvard, MIT, and IITs. He has also served Government of India as IPS officer. It will be my honor to invite Dr. Atul Singh on the dais for his thinker words on response to India's water crisis, independent institutions, national policy, and grassroots efforts.
Can everyone hear me? Good evening. Excellent, excellent. So we have a rather full house to discuss the water situation in India. And I can see by the enthusiasm and the great numbers of the audience that we are in good hands. I'm talking about response to India's water crisis, independent institutions, national policy, and grassroots efforts. But before I do so, can any one of you tell me why are we even talking about water? Why this conference in the first place? Those in the back, anyone? Gentleman in the back. Yes, you sir. In the white jacket. Yes. Why are we discussing water? Why not? Why not Bollywood? Why not cricket?
Because I think water is going to be most important thing in the future.
Why is it important in the future? Why not today?
Because due to our activities, it's got polluted.
Oh, so what's the big deal? If it's polluted, what's the big deal? I mean, you go around any Indian city, you go to the Yamuna, it's polluted, but we are all living our good lives and you can watch cricket and Bollywood. What's the big deal?
That's why we are doing.
But why is it a big deal? Why is it important? Why is pollution so important? It's okay. If things are polluted, we are still living. Life is going on. It has gone on for millennia in this country and other parts of the world. It will probably go on for millennia. Why is it such a big deal? Come on. Yes, lady, why?
Sir, if there will be no water, there will be no life.
Exactamo. Give her a hand. Now, one of the important things that you'll observe when you get to outer space, I've never been to outer space, but I've seen photographs from outer space, is that this seems to be a blue planet. And actually, parts of it, even today, are green, believe it or not. What does that tell you? It tells you, well, that life is possible because we have water on the planet. That's the essential reason water is important. If we believe life is important, some people may not. And an important point to note is that human beings can survive 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water. Obviously, oxygen is even more important. 3 minutes without oxygen means you may die. But it's not just survival. Water is an essential part of the human body. According to H. Mitchell, 83% of the lungs, 79% of muscles and kidneys, 73% of the brain and the heart, 64% of the skin, and 30% of even bones is water. So if you do not have an intake of clean water, things may not be rather hunky-dory. It may intrude in your enjoyment of Bollywood and cricket. Now, we do know that the United Nations has declared that ensuring the availability and sustainability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all is one of the sustainable development goals. But what we forget is that often such high-sounding declarations become cliches because we do not think about them in basic terms. And today, for all declarations, ironically, we are living in a world where clean water is increasingly scarce. In 2009, for instance, the World Health Organization pointed out that 3.4 million people die every year because of water-related diseases, making it perhaps the leading cause of disease and death around the world. Arguably, perhaps now lifestyle-based diseases might be there, but then, which is not too long ago, 3.4 million were dying because of pathogens in the water. And that's because of a lack of sanitation and sewage systems, untreated human and animal fecal matter ends up in water sources, and so does industrial effluent. And as per the WHO, 2.4 billion people in a planet of around 7 billion plus still lack access to sanitation. 663 million lack access to clean drinking water. Now, those are all big figures, but if you walk down any slum, whether it's in Kinshasa or Nairobi or Mumbai or Calcutta or Kolkata, you'll find that access to clean drinking water is really a middle-class luxury. Even today, emerging economies might have achieved extraordinary economic growth, but it has come at the cost of the environment. Water pollution has reached spectacular levels. Let's take the example of China. China is home to more than 1.3 billion people. It is the most populated country in the world. It is also a country that has seen the most remarkable growth, economic growth in human history. The biggest and fastest industrialization of all time. And the Chinese Environment Ministry has also admitted that about 60% of underground water and a third of surface water is unfit for human contact. This is not the UN, this is not the WHO, this is the Chinese Environment Ministry admitting this fact. In fact, almost 70% of its surface water and a growing percentage of its underground reserves are contaminated by biological, toxic, organic, and inorganic pollutants. So what does it tell us? If you have these pollutants, they end up in the soil. If they end up in the soil, they will end up in your food, crops, vegetables, fruits, grains, and in meat. And biomagnification means they'll be concentrated in meat. Obviously fish too, because fish live in water. This means that apart from communicable diseases, water is now causing chronic ones. Heavy metals are making their way into China's food supply. And what people eat on a daily basis is damaging their health and well-being. Now, so much so for pollution of water. What is also interesting is that human beings are using larger quantities of water. The United Nations points out that water use has been growing at more than twice the rate of pollution increase in the last century. In China, increasing desertification is setting off alarm bells as the Gobi Desert gobbles up 3,600 square kilometers of grassland each year. As per the World Bank, if current trends continue, 60% of India's aquifers will be in a critical condition in 20 years. We've seen plenty of presentations today, both chronicling the micro-level pollutions, whether it is Chilka Lake, or the macro-level damage that a certain gentleman from Delhi University spoke about at great length. And importantly, India is relying on aquifers and is pumping out an estimated 230 cubic kilometers. Some say it could be as high as 250 cubic kilometers or even more per year, over a quarter of the global total. Again, these are statistics from the World Bank, which has painted a grim picture not only for India but also for Middle East and North Africa. In fact, there in the MENA region, as the Middle East and North Africa region of the world is called, per capita water availability will fall by half by 2050, with obviously serious consequences for their already stressed aquifers and natural hydrological systems. So the situation is worse globally, at least as far as emerging economies are concerned. And California, with its lush lawns and backyard swimming pools, has also faced several droughts and imposed its first mandatory restriction on water usage in April 2015. So, the spectre of water wars, once painted by Mark Twain, are now suddenly considered real by intelligence agencies and many scholars. So, look at the Syrian conflict. Was water used as a weapon in the Syrian conflict? How many of you say yes? Raise your hands. Only one girl thinks it was used as a weapon? Only one? Two? There's a boy? Raise your hand higher. Only two of you think. What do the rest think? You think it was used as a weapon? Yes or no? No? How many raise your hands? No one raises. Oh, the enthusiasm is spectacular. Anyway, the answer is yes. In fact, it probably proved more effective than barrel bombs. If you cut off water supply to a fort, go back medieval times. If you cut off water supply to a fort, do you think it'll surrender? Yes, no? Yes. You can starve them to submission. Even better, you can make them thirst for life. So, the point is that even societies not at war, rising population, increasing per capita demand, and falling supply make an explosive cocktail. Now, this obviously is a worldwide crisis, but it is even more severe in India. 21% of communicable diseases, as per the World Bank, occur in India because of unclean water and poor hygiene practices. Furthermore, water, in fact, let me rephrase, per capita water availability, which you saw in an earlier presentation, has fallen by 70% from 1951 to 2011. This means that there has been a dramatic decline over 60 years. And the Central Groundwater Board survey has found that groundwater is overexploited in 1 out of every 6 units it assessed. Now that's a pretty high figure. There are plenty of graphs you can see about the per capita availability of water in India. But it's not just groundwater in India that is under threat. Surface water, which includes rivers, lakes, ponds, etc., also happens to be under threat. The Water Resources Information System of India estimates that of the 1,123 cubic kilometers utilizable in the country, the share of surface water is 690 cubic kilometers. And the rest, 433 cubic kilometers, is of course groundwater. And most of the surface water in the country comes from India's mythic rivers, which tend to have divine status, lest we forget the Ganga, the Yamuna, the Narmada, the Krishna, the Kaveri, etc. Few civilizations accord divine status to their rivers, the river as a mother goddess nourishing life. And of the 12 major river basins in the country, the Ganga, Brahmaputra, and Meghna system is the largest of the lot. And this basin is fed by glaciers in the Himalayas. Of course, monsoons swell the rivers, but it is the glaciers that keep them flowing in the dry months of the year. When ferocious hot winds, known as Lu, blow across the northern Indian plains. And mind you, the Himalayan glaciers rank next only to polar ice caps in area and volume. Over 30,000 square kilometers of glaciers provide 8.6 million cubic kilometers of water every year. Now, that's all terrific, but climate change is causing a rise in temperatures across the world. In turn, this is melting glaciers in the Himalayas and forming thousands of glacial lakes there. These lakes might increase water discharge in the short run, because now you have a huge pool of water to feed these lakes. But an acute water shortage is inevitable in the not so long run, because once the lakes are drained, guess what? These are not going to replenish, and they'll drain rather quickly. Obviously, soil erosion, landslides, flood, and drought will accompany this water shortage phenomenon. Now, on the 5th of September 2016, a few months ago, Fair Observer, a journal I have founded and where we have nearly 2,000 writers from over 70 countries, including Nobel Prize winners on one spectrum, at one end of the spectrum, and young students on the other end of the spectrum. Two young Indian engineering students wrote a fantastic article titled, "The Ganges is Too Toxic to Be Holy Anymore." Yash Bharodia and Yuvraj Rajan, two very bright young boys. And they pointed out that the terrifying level of pollution in Ganga is caused not only by dead bodies and ashes of burnt bodies that pollute the river, but also by industrial effluents and untreated urban sewage. They also pointed out that the discharge of effluents has more than doubled in the last 20 years. And experts predict another 100% increase in the following 20 years. The young authors rightly argued that though the Central Pollution Control Board classifies a mere 764 industries as grossly polluting industries, it fails to provide adequate details or analysis of the level of devastation and does precious little to tackle this problem. Now, even as rivers are in peril, lakes are suffering too. Asit K. Biswas, Cecilia Tortajada, and Udisha Saklani of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy explain how water bodies across rural India, including man-made lakes and reservoirs, are fast disappearing after decades of neglect and pollution. Vimal Mishra of the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, where I'm a visiting professor, has repeatedly lectured about the decline of traditional water bodies such as talabs, pokhars, bawdis, and tanks. Years of subsidized electricity has let many farmers rely on tube wells and pump out groundwater with wanton abandon. Shockingly, India pumps out more water than China and the US combined. Now, it is important to note that neither of these two countries is renowned for its efficient water use. Therefore, we are wasteful even by wasteful standards. Now, why do Indians engage in reckless overuse? Why? Why do you think that's happening? Anyone? Why? Lack of regulatory aspects. So if we had regulation, what you're saying is everything would be hunky-dory, we'd all sing Kumbaya. Well, if you have regulation, presumably you need someone to impose it, right? You couldn't just have the law. Even the most perfect law is entirely useless if there is no enforcement authority. And if you have an enforcement authority, sometimes it may make incorrect decisions. So you do need a judiciary, presumably, a functioning one, where you don't go to court and get stuck for 25 years, and your next generation still wades its way through the dusts that have gathered over time. So, regulation may not be all, right? Anyway, the point is no one theory completely explains why Indians engage in what The Economist has called reckless overuse. Yet, the facts indicate that Indians are using water with no heed to the future. In an article published on May 25, 2016, this publication of 1843 vintage quoted a European Commission report that estimated over 20 million boreholes in India. In the 60s, this number was a mere tens of thousands. So naturally, water tables are falling. The average fall apparently is 0.3 meters, according to The Economist, but in some places, the decline is as high as 4 meters. Now, given the fact that surface water is going down and is polluted, groundwater is going down, is also polluted, it's a bit of an irony that many water-starved regions still cultivate water-hungry crops such as paddy, cotton, and sugarcane. So we have a water shortage, and yet we cultivate crops in precisely those parts which need a lot of water. You could argue these are cash crops, this is how farmers make money, but often with these crops, they end up committing suicide because of debt instead of making money. So the answer is not as simple as it seems. Anyway, if you look at China is using 28% less fresh water than India, and its population is presumably just a touch higher, or roughly very similar. And if you look at the amount of water residents of Delhi, Kolkata, or Bengaluru consume, and compare that to what residents of cities such as Singapore, Leipzig, or Barcelona consume, it's roughly double. Then water-intensive industries are also on the rise. Thermal power production needs water. Extraction and mining need water. Manufacturing needs water. And as if all this is not enough, Americano dreams of rampant consumption have led to the creation of gated communities and golf courses. Like one of the things that I find when I land in India, particularly in Delhi, is these advertisements for really posh places with film stars. I don't even remember most of their names, but suffice to say that they are dressed in Americano fashion, selling Americano dreams, Americano lifestyles, in a land that is a third in area size and has 4 times the population, and where we didn't conveniently have Native Americans to kill. America is based on a consumerist society because they conveniently committed genocide of all the Native Americans and had a big continent to exploit. So you can have your big homes, you can drive the big car, you can have the swimming pool in the backyard. But who are we going to kill for, or who are the elites going to kill to have such big homes? You cannot have that consumption in an old civilization and overpopulated land with scarce resources. Now, as per NASA, the Indian subcontinent now boasts the second most overstressed aquifer in the world, second only to the Arabian aquifer system. Now, the scientists have chronicled in great detail the dire state of water resources. But the status quo persists. Do Indians care? If so, can they act? If not, why not? And if Indians neither care nor are able to act, what is the future of this multiple millennia old civilization? Now, one can look at water in isolation, or one can look at water as part of a broader tragedy unfolding across India and indeed some other parts of the world. In my view, in the post-1991 era, where growth is the new religion and mammon the great god, the tragedy of the commons has occurred in many emerging economies such as Kenya, Brazil, and India. Consumerism in these former colonies has led to economic growth, greater average spend on cars or restaurants, and certainly great entrepreneurship. However, during this very period, forest cover has declined in all three countries. Pollution has increased in all three countries, and corruption has skyrocketed in all three countries. Dominant elites have conveniently privatized public resources at ridiculously throwaway prices. Now, of course, the most extreme example is Russia. But countries like Kenya, Brazil, and India do not seem to be too far behind. This privatization of public resources, in my view, has led to a me, and myself culture. The focus is on individual consumption and immediate gratification. So, you want water, you want it now. Great. Now you can buy a bottle. If you're middle class, you can have a reverse osmosis system. Great, you've got it now. Who cares or thinks about tomorrow? Well, the answer is not very many people. Who thinks about, let's say, water for the community? Well, the answer is certainly not the elite, it seems, who have their servants and their butlers and their valets and their palaces, their gilded palaces. Now, let's take a step back. If we are to solve this issue, do we need grassroots efforts? Well, I would argue absolutely. Ralegaon Siddhi and the waterman of India, Rajendra Singh, are famous examples wherein the traditional water systems that have lasted centuries, the bawdis, the talabs, the tanks, whatever you follow in whatever region, have been rejuvenated. Thank you. And wells suddenly have water again. Pastures have been rejuvenated. But it has come after extremely strong collective action. No one individual can go and dig up a talab. And most of these talabs, or most of these water bodies, have become places where rubbish is thrown and drains empty. Because everyone thought, oh, we can pump out water, so why care? The reality is that if you do not have these structures, tomorrow you may have water, day after you may have water, day after you may have water, but one day things will run dry. And so, there has to be a realization, and there has to be some cohesion, and there has to be both knowledge as well as will. And of course, sometimes you'll have great leaders, local leaders, who will transform it, but you need that local control across India. But that alone will not be enough, because that village cannot really change the river Ganga. In fact, there is a recent book, River of Life, River of Death, published by a former Financial Times correspondent. But it came out only in December, I believe December 19th, by Oxford University Press. And it chronicles how Ganga, that has given life to India, is ironically being killed by Indians, and in turn it is killing India. It's a fantastic book. The only regret I have is that it was written by an Englishman, not an Indian. But more to the point, and this is the point, that the river cannot be cleansed entirely by grassroots efforts. And for that, what do we need? We need to care then as a larger entity, perhaps first as a state. And so that means that a city like Kanpur can no longer discharge effluents straight into the river. Now, it's at the level of the individual. Let's say one of you owns a leather factory and you're making shoes and you're supplying some big chain in the US. If you were to follow the law, and if you were not to discharge your effluents in the Ganga, and everyone else did, you'd be out of business, because they would undercut you, your costs would be higher, theirs would be lower, you wouldn't exist. And so at the individual level, this is the classic economic idea, this is the classic idea in economics of the prisoner's dilemma. Everyone is using a suboptimal option. And pardon me for using jargon, what I mean to say is that if a system is broken, let's say you go to the RTO, the Road Transport Office, and there basically you have to bribe to get a license. At the individual level, because you need to drive to get to work, to get a salary, to feed your kids, you have no option. So you choose to bribe. Or rather, it's a false choice. You don't choose, you have to bribe. But if everyone ends up bribing, you have a system which is highly inefficient. First, you get drivers on the road who shouldn't be on the road, so it means more people get injured, get killed, healthcare costs rise, so on and so forth. And so at the collective level, you're ending up with disaster. Short-term, immediate private interest is trumping long-term public good. And at some level, the social cohesion in the district and the level of consciousness has to rise. And that will only rise if we, and I will not use passive voice, because passive voice is generally a colonial phenomenon. The British left us with passive voice. This has to be done, therefore, we recommend that this, or not even therefore, it has been considered, this has been done. No passive voice for me. For me, passive voice is a clear signal of an enslaved mind. What I have to say here is very simple, is that each one of us has to go out and start talking about water as a life and death matter. We have to fill up the holes when we talk about water. We have to go to our villages, we have to go to our family and somehow convince them that, look, we are living on borrowed time and we have to act, and the time to act is now. And it has to percolate through our institutions, it has to percolate through the discourse, and it has to percolate into the consciousness of the country. It's then that districts might be able to act. It's then that states might be able to act. The colonial system bequeathed to us by the British is no longer working. It is not working in many former colonies. We are not alone. Bit by bit, it has crumbled in many parts of the world. The Sykes-Picot universe of 1916 that created the modern Middle East, with a Frenchman and an Englishman having fine wine and expensive cigars, is dead. C'est fini, c'est tout. not last here too. So, at some point, we have to have a policy and a national policy, and it will only come when the people demand it. And it will only come when collectively the people demand the cities to have systems that are better at managing waste. Cities that are better at cleaning up the effluent, cleaning up the urban water discharge and the effluents. And apart from a policy, it will need institutions that impose it. Independent institutions. We have the Chief Election Commission that largely works. And it works because it is independent. We have some other independent institutions that work. For instance, the metro was built because Sridharan had independence. He had technical expertise. And we will need independent institutions filled not by officials of the state who one day are in agriculture, tomorrow in culture, and the third day in finance. Or people who one day are running X and then going to Y and appearing like Bade Sahibs, Brown Sahibs. It'll change when we have an independent institutions with teeth and with expertise and with will. And that'll only come when the consciousness changes, when we demand it. It's a national priority. And along with that, we'll have to change our individual behaviors, because what are the two things that can save water? Well, one, cut down demand, and two, improve supply. Cutting down demand can be done at an individual level. If people look at a big farmhouse and a big lawn, not with, oh, ooh la la, ex-celebrity from Hollywood or Bollywood, sorry, Bollywood, I'm speaking in India, not in America, so I should just bash up Bollywood. Hollywood or Bollywood has a big lawn and is playing golf, and if we look up to it and aspire to it, then we are all going to die. The reason is, oh, he's drinking lovely poison, looks great, we'll all drink it too. While the reality is that if someone has a big lawn, oh, well, that fellow is an arch villain. And the reality is, damn it, in a poor country where water is in crisis, you want a bloody lawn. You must be a criminal, if not a thief. Actually, criminal thieves are criminals. So you must be a criminal, if not a wasteful, extravagant, modern-day Muhammad Shah Rangila. And somehow, we've got to develop a new aesthetic consciousness, particularly when it comes to water, and focus on lowering consumption in everything, whether it is agriculture, where consumption is wasteful, household consumption, which is not as egregious as agriculture, but certainly contributory because of the goods it wants, or even industry, because there have to be fetters there too. At some level, there has to be some consciousness there. And supply. I've talked about collective action to improve groundwater harvesting. I've talked about improving the fate of the rivers. Obviously, we cannot do much about the glaciers. They are beyond our hands, but perhaps we can have more energy efficient practices in this country. But really what I'm arguing for is that we care and we act. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The session was full of passion and priceless knowledge. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ajay Singh to present Moment 2 to Dr. Atul Singh.